Ziti TV. Ken, I don't know if you caught last week's Ziti TV, but it was a fun one about browser bring up. Only mention it because we here at OpenZIti we use Restream to do our streaming. And there's a little button up there that says "Start the Stream," and I don't know if you're aware of this whole uh, not boomers, but like Gen Xers do the pause. Have you ever heard of the streamer pause?
It doesn't actually ring a bell.
So what happens is a person of a certain age will sit there and just stare at the screen for a certain amount of time before actually starting the stream. And so the younger generation chastises and makes fun of the older people like myself who just sit there and do that because they don't us older people, we're waiting for the thing to turn on because it used to take so long when we were younger. And so last week I wanted to eliminate this. I wanted to be part of the cool gang. And so when the restream thing said go, I went immediately. And then I went and I watched the
Is this thing on?
I went exactly, dunk, dunk, dunk.
I think we're live.
So I went and I watched the stream afterwards, and 100%, it cut off the first 5 seconds of the stream.
I think we did the same thing because the little light didn't even come on until a few seconds after you started.
So who knows how this one will turn out? But it's always fun. Today on Ziti TV, I think it's going to be a fun one. We've got a special guest star. Mr. Mike Guthrie. I see him sitting behind the scenes. Ken, how was your week off? Was it good?
Oh, it was relaxing. This was one of the good ones. Not one of the sad vacations.
Sure.
This was a good vacation. Family, gathering, rental house, at the lake, playing on the water, boat, sunburn. Awesome.
Fantastic sunburns. That's a thing of the past for my children. They've never had a sunburn before because we've been adamant about sunblock until this last. Now the child is old enough to think for himself.
I warned you.
And so he's like, I'm good. I'm impervious to sun burn. And we went to Florida, and he, his whole back was peeling. All right. So today on Ziti TV, we got a user spotlight, a fun one, like I alluded to. We're going to spotlight NetFoundry, right? That sounds like fun, doesn't it? Normally, you wouldn't think of somebody who works in the same company as us as a user spotlight, but I mean, we are a user, right? Well, we most definitely use our own software. And so I was asking around, hey, does anybody want to come and do a Ziti TV? And our friend Mike Guthrie said, yeah, I'll do a Ziti TV. And so I think we can bring Mike on and say hi. Hey, Mike. We're live.
Awesome.
So Mike is going to hopefully share his screen today at some point, and that's why he wasn't here at the beginning. So hopefully all the permissions are sorted, and if not, then we'll figure it out when it goes live. But thanks for coming back, Mike. Always interested in having you here to see what kind of things you're particularly doing with OpenZIti, or I should say we, I guess, are doing with OpenZIti, right? So when I put the feelers out this week amongst the team saying, hey, somebody want to do a Ziti TV, you said, I could do one. What can you recap for us what it is that you offered to do?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to highlight something kind of in the Ziti ecosystem that's become one of my favorite tools. It's actually some of Ken Bingham's handiwork actually that I got to take advantage of. It's the ziti-host container, and this is a container where you don't need it to do any type of intercepting of traffic, but you only need it to host a service. It's very, very lightweight, and you can drop it just about anywhere. I've found that I am using it wherever I can now at this point, because as a DevOps guy, I don't always have control over source code of an application, but I do have control over, say, what goes into a container cluster or an application stack. It's become a pretty slick tool to solve a bunch of problems. And anytime I come across a tool that to me is a little bit of a Swiss Army knife where I can use it for multiple purposes, I definitely kind of adopt it into my tool chain.
So you described yourself as a DevOps guy. Can you remind everybody what would you say you do here?
Yep. So I lead what's called our RAV team, which stands for Reliability, Automation, and Visibility. It's a blur of DevOps and site reliability. So any kind of deployment automation, automation around QA, insight into what's going on with the health of our systems. So any type of visibility we can build around that, reliability engineering, and then I also do quite a bit with data warehousing and data analytics, both at the systems level, but also interacting with kind of business data as well, gathering data from all sorts of different sources so that we can have it all together for business uses. So lots of hats, but it's usually the way I like it. I like to play with a lot of different tech, and it's a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, I totally understand that. It's nice to be able to go as they say, to be a T shape or an I shape kind of guy, right? Like going wide and being a T shape kind of person is oftentimes fun and interesting. So I share a lot of that sort of sentiments. Now, you had also said that you use the ziti-host container. I also used the ziti-host container just the other day. We had a user out in discourse doing some cool stuff with Prometheus and trying to use the little templates that we have built into the tunnelers. So trying to reduce the number of services that were necessary. So they had Prometheus is neat because it scrapes, it wants to reach out and get the metrics from somewhere. It doesn't expect the metrics to be pushed to it.
Yep.
And so that provides a problem if your scrape targets are behind firewalls, right?
Yep.
And so clearly this user is trying to have a centralized Prometheus server and wanted to scrape a bunch of stuff at a bunch of different locations. And so they've used tunneler, they put tunnelers on all the locations. And then using, I think it's $DST_host name in your service. Basically, if you name your identity in a predefined way so that you can address a identity using its name, the actual identity name, then you could have n targets all scraped by one particular service. So I used the ziti-host container with Docker to set up 3 bespoke Docker networks, no exposed ports in any of those Docker networks.
Yep.
And then I used Ziti to connect into that Docker network world that simply wasn't exposed in any way, shape, or form. And it sounds kind of similar, maybe, to what you were doing.
Yeah.
Where do you find yourself using the ziti-host container? Like, is there any place in particular?
Yeah, I think the one I wanted to highlight, and here'll be the moment of truth here. Let me see if I
can. Mike share his screen, everybody? Drum roll,
yes.
please.
Stand by. Gotta find it.
Yeah, that ziti-host container is the common concept would be reverse proxy. It lets you plant a Ziti agent in whatever special network environment that has access to the private services so that you can access them through Ziti as a reverse proxy.
Yep.
And we have liftoff.
Sweet. That was sweating a little bit on that one, but we got her working. Excellent.
Real quick, there was a question from chat.
Oh yeah.
Happens to be from Ken. Does NetFoundry use the same open source Ziti that is in GitHub? Same versions?
Yes, it does. We run. We have a little bit of bake time in terms of the day a new release is cut, but we try to keep up with it within a couple versions of the moment a new release comes out. And so we've got a couple networks that we use internally. One in particular where we kind of pilot basically the latest versions that get published, but we try to kick the tires and exercise the new versions as soon as they come out, and then make them available to to customers for the services that we're hosting as soon as possible too. So
very cool. Now I can't help but notice I already see the word zrock on the screen. If people haven't been introduced to zrock yet, you definitely should check out zrock.io. Very, very cool tool that Michael Quigley has been working on so diligently, and now is free to the public. You should check it out. Lets you basically provide public sharing to a private resource or private sharing to a private resource. So if you haven't checked out zrock, go check it out. It's free to sign up. It's a cool tool. You should definitely give it a roll. And so zrock is interesting to us because it's brand new, right? Like, well, not brand new, but I mean, new enough. And so I see some Xerox here. So you're gonna show us how you're using the ziti-host container with Xerox in some way.
Yeah, so this was kind of a fun implementation for Ziti because what you're seeing behind the scenes is our application stack for our cloud hosted Xerox, because that's one of the offerings we have with Xerox was you can use our public hosted offering for it. But with any application stack, a common problem that people have, when you're building a production stack, is one of the first things you do is you end up, you want to make sure everything's locked down, everything's got least privilege for your setup. But then, of course, developers might need to debug or troubleshoot something. You need to set up some sort of developer access and support. So historically, a lot of times what would happen is now you got to
always the developers.
Yep. So you got to blow open all the doors and now create all sorts of access points that mess up your nice tight security that you initially spec'd out. And so when we did the Xerox environment, I've become a pretty big fan of AWS Fargate just because it is a completely serverless container orchestration. So the longer I do DevOps, the less I want to worry about VMs. I don't want to administrate servers. Like if I'm building an application stack, I just want to worry about the stack itself. I don't want to have to worry about scaling underlying nodes underneath to make sure I've got enough capacity and all that. What I've liked about Fargate is that I don't have to worry about that. I just say, hey, just run my container, and I just give it a container definition, and it just runs. And so, and I wanted to try and keep the Xerox environment completely serverless. So basically, an entire an account and environment that didn't have any VMs in it at all. So that basically that's from a security standpoint, we don't have to worry about that, and an administration point, we don't have to worry about that either. And so what I ended up doing is that when it came time to figure out developer access, support access, as well as various things for data warehousing and ETL, decided to rely on the ziti-host container to be part of the application stack. And so as you can see with our various ECS services here, we've got a couple different parts of it. Xerox Control, Xerox HTTP, that's part of the Xerox application stack that comes with the Xerox binary. InfluxDB is the metric store behind Xerox. And then there's also, not shown here, is also a Postgres database that's used. But key things that we needed to set up for support access, we needed support access for InfluxDB. That was kind of the initial one, both for bootstrapping and some kind of initial debugging and setup. And then later came along need to be able to interact with Postgres and kind of be able to debug and troubleshoot and things like that.
And Mike, Postgres would be the database where Xerox stores data, and Influx is a time series database where we put metrics?
Correct, yep. So anybody who's used Xerox and you see the kind of the cool dashboards that show all your metrics kind of coming by in near real time. So that's actually InfluxDB behind that. That's powering that. And so one of the things initially when we launched, I actually ran the ziti-host container as a sidecar to the Influx DB service. And what was nice about that is when you do sidecar setup is like you can keep it very, very locked down. So basically, only the application can talk to it, and because the ziti-host container is just talking to a local host, it's inside of the same security group, and you can keep it very, very restricted and very isolated in terms of how you set up your access control.
And so this Amazon Fargate thing has a similar idea that like Kubernetes has of pods, where a sidecar is another container that is delivered next to the one that you like Influx or whatever.
Yeah. So as part of a service, and I don't know the comparable terminology in Kubernetes because we more of an AWS shop, at least on my side of the fence. But for like InfluxDB, as part of this InfluxDB service, I can launch a ziti-host container as part of it. Or if I wanted to do something special, where like a special monitoring agent, something as a sidecar, that actually becomes encapsulated as part of this service, and then you
Does
can
it-
wrap it inside of the security group rules for that service if you want.
Yeah, I would just call that a sidecar. It's basically the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like the exact same idea. Yeah, I was just that's just education for me and for everybody else who might be watching.
Yep.
Let's see. Oh, I had a follow up, but then I forgot what it was. Oh
Oh,
well. Anyway,
I'll,
continue.
I'll chat for a little bit and see if it comes back to you. But after we initially launched that, fairly quickly afterwards, the need arose to be able to interact with PostgreSQL, which is the database backend for Xerox as well. And I realized it might just be easier to have kind of an all-purpose developer access container that was running. So I actually set up the Xerox Bastion container, and all this is running the ziti-host container image. If you search Docker Hub for OpenZIti, ziti-host, it's a very, very lightweight container, and the only thing that you need to supply is an identity token as a secret to the container, and it takes on that identity and becomes a host for Ziti services. And so essentially this is now kind of the access point for developers and support members for InfluxDB, PostgreSQL, and then we've also added recently RabbitMQ as part of the application stack, and so we've granted access for that as well.
And so you have made the decision then, it sounds, to not use sidecars. And so you, instead of having 4 ZD tunnels, you have the one. Is that?
Yep. Correct. And in terms, and this is sort of a personal preference for how I like to do AWS security groups, but I typically, I'll build a security group per service, and I'll have it so that the only things that can talk to a security group are other members of the security group. So essentially, I'll have I'll have like an InfluxDB security group. I will make the Bastion a member of that security group, and it just minimizes, and it basically makes it so you don't have to worry about any outside IPs that are ever accessing it. It just abstracts it so that there's never any IPs in your security groups at all. It's just basically saying, no, you just have to be a member to be able to interact with this port. And so for the Postgres security group, the Influx security group, and the Rabbit security group, this Bastion becomes a member of those, and that grants the access to where it can talk to the actual endpoints within it.
This is a good point for me to stop and ask Ken. Ken, would you like me to relay your question, or would you like to relay your questions? Ken has more questions for you.
I was trying to think of questions. Feel free to pick them off and throw them into the conversation as if you want, or skip over them. But I was wondering about this one, Mike.
The version. Let's see if we're to pin the version. I am a believer in version pinning. My one downside is occasionally forgetting to go back and refresh that version. But that's just kind of an old, coming from more of an ops background where I did it for a couple of years in a larger environment, even with things like RPMs and things like that. Where
if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Exactly, and it's like,
Yeah.
and if you get still want to upgrade periodically, but you can upgrade in a planned window where you can monitor that upgrade.
Right. Change control.
Yeah, and kind of verify. That was a huge thing at my previous place where all changes needed to be basically reported and planned and done during off hours and things like that. And so all that kind of old school ops stuff is kind of definitely drilled into me, to where it's just like, no,
just ingrained.
Yep.
Yeah.
Generally pin the versions, and every once in a while I'll be lazy and use latest somewhere, and then some and it'll
kick yourself later.
Yeah, I'll be like, I should have pinned it. I know better. And so I'm a believer in version pinning, but yeah,
it's good to know how to use each option. I'm just curious how people are actually using it.
Mm-hmm.
There's another one on the same vein about, there are 2 different ways to give the ZD identity to the ziti-host container. I wonder which one you found useful.
I ended up using, let's see, there's basically just the environment variable. Let me dig in.
As an environment variable. Okay.
Yeah.
You probably don't want to show that then.
Well, it's it'll just, it's basically
It's happened
just
before.
No, I believe it's happened. It is just the ARN of the secret, because that's the other thing, that AWS has a built-in way to where it'll do just-in-time translation of the secret. So from the admin panel, it's not set up to reveal any. reveal
Gotcha.
any secrets, but let me see if I can go dig up the JSON. Stand by.
Yeah, no, you can also pass the one-time enrollment token as standard input, but for this kind of environment like ECS or Fargate, then it makes a lot of sense to store it as an environment variable so you don't have to set up volumes.
Yeah, and
yeah, there it is.
Yep.
Ziti identity JSON is the environment variable that you're
Yep.
passing in.
And
As the
our
AWS secret.
our access volume is pretty low, so where it's just like, we might once or twice a week be using this. But I'd also like this method too, just in the event that, let's say you want to do HA with this type of setup, or you want to be able to have two of them running. I like to be able to have them, scale up or down as needed if I ever want that option.
Mike, is it a common thing that you do, or do you ever look at who uses that service and when? Is that something you can do with Ziti?
Yes, definitely yes. And let me swing. Yeah, actually, I'll swing over there. I'm wondering if we have this. We've done it recently. Let me go look. So that's
So
the
we're
other
looking
thing.
at here. We're looking at Cloud Ziti, right? Like,
Yep.
If people are familiar with the Ziti admin console, it's got some similarities and some major differences. So
Yep. So one of the things that I
ooh, pretty.
Yep. One of the things that, let me see here. Message by endpoints. But of course, I was on it this morning. Let me go back 7 days. This is staging, so we haven't used it a whole lot. But essentially, the other reason I like using Ziti for the developer access setup is that when you get that question of, who's been accessing this service, we can actually go look at that specific service and see, or we can first go look and say, has there been any traffic to this service, which should be, support access only, and should be controlled, monitored, and so forth. It gives us a way to be able to do that through traffic analysis. We can actually go back and see the specific identities that have accessed it and when they actually pass traffic. And so we'll use that.
let me ask a slightly different question. Do we often, or is there a reason we have or haven't restricted outbound access from these machines too? So do we set up the security group so that you can only outbound via a tunnel through Ziti?
I haven't set them up that way. I'll typically do, I tend to be pretty liberal on outbound access in security groups, but I'll go pretty as restrictive as possible on the inbound.
But if we wanted to, we would be able to do that, right? Like, regardless of the actual need for the thing to get somewhere it needs to get to. I just mean, like, should somebody try to get into the system, we could set it up so that somebody couldn't, like, outbound things that shouldn't go outbound, right?
I believe so. That gets into some of the more complicated service setup that I am less familiar with. So.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
And that's truthfully part of what I like about Ziti is that I am not a network engineer, and in terms of background, that's one area where I do feel weak. And what I like about Ziti is that it allows me to create that connectivity that I need without creating network problems. Essentially,
without worrying about it, right?
Yeah, because I mean, you talked about at the beginning with that Prometheus example of you need to be able to reach a lot of places. So one of my backgrounds was kind of old school infrastructure monitoring, which is built around that polling model. So of course, when I came into a place and one of the first things they had me do was basically rebuild the infrastructure monitoring, one of the first things I had to do was go meet with the Linux administrator and say, all right, I need you to punch a whole bunch of holes in the firewall for my monitoring tool to be able to go and get to all these places where normally they would be locked down and restricted. And so within DevOps and site reliability, you end up often being the troublemaker because you are that guy walking around punching holes in everything that everybody works so hard to lock down.
But you need it. You must.
But you need it, yeah, because it's for I mean, there's a couple of, like, classic DevOps use cases where this is really important, and you got, looking at one here, this is of course like the developer support access scenario. But deployment is another scenario. Typically, your deployment is going to be something completely separated from your live environment. And then monitoring is another case. And the one that I've that also use Ziti quite a bit extensively here is kind of our ETL processes for gathering data,
like what
and
we just
collecting
saw,
for our data
right?
warehouse. Yeah.
And so,
Yep.
do we have? I don't know if you can share any dashboards that we've. So, do you have a dashboard that we've built for staging? Like, is that the sort of thing that you're using for ETL? Is that what you mean?
Well, let me think here. I have one. I don't have one up. I'm pulling up shortly. Um, yeah.
If not, that's okay. Like, I don't know what we can or should or shouldn't show.
Yeah,
Obviously.
I'm running through my mind of leaking
Yeah,
any
yeah,
internals
yeah,
that we
yeah.
shouldn't show.
So let me
Um,
ask it differently then. So
yeah,
we do have internal dashboards
yeah,
for, say, Zrock and other things, customer networks, all that sort of stuff.
yep,
And the ETL that you're doing specifically for Zrock, it is through that bastion that you just showed us.
yes, yeah. So let me go
That's
back.
what I was trying to ask. And so we have some process that extracts, transforms, and loads the ETL process
Yep,
from, like, say, influx. Does it go from influx
yep.
to where does it
Yeah,
go?
so
What is it?
so we have ETLs. They're going through this bastion, and they're fetching data from. They're getting kind of daily roll up data from InfluxDB, and then we also do, every couple hours, it basically grabs a snapshot of the entire Postgres database as well. And what it lets us do is we can bring it all together and create business reporting out of that. So
So you extract the database in order to put it someplace else to run queries against it.
yeah, so basically we create
Nice.
there's we create a read-only copy of the database, and we've got stuff in there to basically anything that's we have exclusions for anything that's like a sensitive field that we don't want in a like a business database. And so we'll pull out kind of the stuff that we need, pull that into a central data warehouse. And what that lets us do is it makes you kind of normalize all your data. So whether it's originally time series data or relational data, whatever, it all becomes relational data. And then you can start to just query and join it across data sources for business purposes.
And so in the past, you would have had to do all of this with just Amazon security groups. Is that the way you'd have to do it? Whitelisting IPs and that sort of thing?
Lots of whitelisting IPs. You can do it with things like all the ones I'm going to list off are things that I think about them now. I'm like, oh, I hate doing it this way because to me they're gross now.
Yeah.
But things like you have to whitelist the internet gateway of the other account to be able to talk to
Right.
yours, but you don't. I mean, that basically says anything running in that account can reach across and query. And then same thing for. I'm really not a fan of VPC peering, which is another way in which people do this, to where they'll link their VPCs either within an account or across accounts or things like that. And I'm really not a fan of that either, because it's just basically if you have something exposed in one VPC, you're now exposing the entire other VPC as well, because it just there's not a good way to ensure that what is actually talking across those bridges, so to speak. So that's traditionally how a lot of those are done.
That makes sense.
And
And
I'm
like
no longer
I
a fan of
always
those
get
because there's a better way. So
and I always get goofy, like, if you travel and you're at a hotel and you're on the Wi-Fi, you don't want to open that IP, or if you're at Starbucks or wherever you might be, same problem when you're whitelisting IPs. Like, totally, I love the I love the quote. It feels gross now.
yeah, yep,
Because it's totally true. Like, and then if you're working with a large customer, Microsoft or Google's or whatever, with thousands of employees, and they all funnel through an exit node, you basically whitelist everybody. It's just, it can be a
yep.
mess.
Well, and things like managing access to a database, for example. Traditionally, a lot of places they'll just use an SSH based bastion. But of course, now you've got a server that's got ports open. You got to manage SSH keys potentially on that server, and you have to whitelist the IP and manage that as well. Again, I just like this method because there's no server. All that administration overhead just doesn't exist because this is in here. I pop it in the security group. The developer who does need access, they can connect straight from their IDE as long as they're granted access through Ziti. So.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think what else? Yeah, I think the other reason that I like this method, and one of the reasons I wanted to kind of highlight it, because I think we've done probably in the past more focused around kind of Kubernetes and Kubernetes environments where it is container orchestration, but you do have servers underneath, and a popular method is to put ZT tunnel running on those servers, and this being a more unique case to where you don't have any VMs underneath the hood. So how do you how do you set up ZT inside of your cluster? You can do an app embedded implementation, which is the most secure. But I wanted to highlight this as an option because there's a lot of shops where, in terms of how teams are broken up, that's not necessarily going to be an option for them, to where they want to be able to get that zero trust as close as they can. But for example, the DevOps team, they might not have any influence or control at all over what's happening in the application space. There's some of that dynamic here with Cloud ZT, to where I don't our Cloud ZT is Java, for example. I don't want to be in Java. I don't think those guys want me in the Java, and I wouldn't step into that space. But I work on the infrastructure side. So how can I create the access that's needed, or how can I secure this as needed without having to without kind of having to overlap spaces necessarily?
Yeah,
It allows kind
that
of a
makes
clean line of
sense.
separation of concerns, so that at worst case scenario, let's say we launched an API and said, hey, we want this to be secured and zero trust, but you're not going to have any ability to, you can't change the source code, but we need to make it as secure as possible. Well, that's fine. I can just run ziti-host as a sidecar and basically make a dark API, completely secure API, but I don't have to
Right.
I don't have to get in the developer's space in terms of working within platform-specific code.
Yeah, and the other way too. You don't have to renegotiate the relationship or the purview, because you can run ZT as just another app.
Yeah.
Pretty much anywhere. And in the Kubernetes space, that also applies to the namespaces. A lot of Kubernetes administrators will use namespaces to carve up their resources and control permissions. So you could do like Helm install ZT-host in a namespace in a cluster where namespaces are segregated. And now you've just planted your reverse proxy ZT-host agent into that one namespace, and it can't talk to anything else.
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
I think.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, and being in, here I work where we've got probably two primary language sets too, but at a previous place, it was, I worked where it was 3 DevOps guys versus about 120 developers. So you imagine in a space like that, you're doing deployments all the time, you're setting up support types of things all the time. And of course, you truly have no business doing any interaction with source code, and some of the stuff may have been there for 5 years. And so I think about, trying to make things more secure and zero trust, and you get environments like that to where you might be supporting so many teams, but it's like you need a language agnostic way to make it zero trust. I like this approach because, again, it gets me as close as possible to having full end-to-end encryption without me having to worry about what's going on inside of the application. The application can remain a black box, but I can still, as far as the infrastructure setup, I can still set up zero trust. So,
Yeah,
and without losing the visibility of what's actually going on for anybody that cares.
Yeah.
Well, let's also not lose sight of the fact that once you have your OpenZIti overlay network, you could then let those developers start using OpenZIti services too, because you'll have the infrastructure for your network in place, and hopefully then you wouldn't even need to deploy the tunneler because you'll just be application embedded. That'd be cool. Well, Mike, that is a cool Ziti TV. Thanks for showing us a little bit about how we as NetFoundry go about using OpenZIti. I think that was really neat. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, man. Ken, anything from you? Any closing thoughts?
No, that's pretty cool to see how it's working. Feel free to ask for more if you think of something that would be great that doesn't seem to exist. Try to hear that out.
Push it forward. Love it. All right, fellas. Well, thanks for great Ziti TV, and everybody out there watching. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, guys.